If you love the Mental Health Warriors podcast, the best thing you can do to support the show is to share it. Share it on social media, share it with your friends, share it with people that you think that this episode would connect with, because the more people we reach, the more people we can help. And that is why I am doing this. So thank you for that. And thank you for listening. Well, we're back after the Christmas break, and thankfully I did not gorge myself on too much turkey and junk food. I'm not going to lie. I did eat some, and probably more than I would normally, but all things considered, when I compare it to other Christmases, I was quite in control this year, so I'm quite thankful for that. Anyways, this summer, I was sitting in the backyard, this beautiful, peaceful backyard, fountain going, cross-legged on a couch, drinking green tea, talking to the most amazingly peaceful woman about the power of breath and Ayurveda. And I thought to myself, my God, it is unbelievable how much my world has changed. I never could have imagined myself being here talking about this with such an amazing person, even just a few years ago. And I felt profoundly grateful in that moment to be able to share this experience with her. So I'm excited to introduce you to Sophie Hawkins. She's my guest today. And we have this really cool conversation where we talk about her experience. And she's got a really interesting story, how she sort of suffered at the hands of the traditional medical system. And then what her experience was like that led her to get into, I guess, the traditional medical system, and then what she's learned since. And we talk a lot about the power of the breath and how beneficial and grounding and critical it is to our own sense of peace and tranquility and well-being. And we talk about Ayurveda. We talk about all kinds of different things, to be honest with you. But it was a wonderful conversation. And I'm going to include her bio on the show notes page. But what I wanted to say was that Sophie is also a Thai yoga massage, or Thai massage, I guess, practitioner. And I've had the chance to have a Thai massage with Sophie. And I got to tell you, if you live in the London area, and you gotta check it out. It was such a wonderful experience. I loved it. It was healing and peaceful. And I just walked out of there feeling better and more relaxed, and also like I had formed a real human connection with someone. So thank you, Sophie, for that. You are an amazing woman. You are a master of your craft, and you taught me a lot, and I'm really grateful for it. So listen, everybody, enjoy this episode, and remember, take away from it. Well, I guess one thing you could take away from it is that your breath is really the center of everything. And there's so much of an opportunity to be more conscious and aware and grounded of our breathing, and to use it to our advantage, especially when times are stressful and we want to kind of come back into ourselves and not let ourselves get carried away with our own thoughts and emotions. And I've been practicing it a lot since I first met Sophie. And, I like everything else, it's going to be a lifetime journey, but I'm glad she planted the seed to help me see that there was an important piece of the puzzle that I could learn about and implement. So thank you to Sophie for that. And thank you for doing this podcast. And thanks again for the massage. Even though it was a few months ago, I'm still feeling limber. All right, guys, enjoy this episode. Oh, yeah, and there's one other thing I wanted to mention. Sophie's internet connection was not the best on this episode, so it sometimes made having the conversation a little bit challenging, and I couldn't tell where she stopped talking. So you won't hear that on the recording because of the software that I use. Like, you won't hear any bad sound quality. But if the conversation, there's a few moments where it doesn't seem like it's flowing, that's the reason why. So it doesn't detract from the power of the conversation and Sophie's message, but I just wanted to make sure that I called that out. Okay, guys, enjoy the episode.
Warriors are not born. Warriors are forged in the crucible of adversity. Warriors without fear are warriors without courage. We are men, destroying stigma and stereotypes. We are a band of brothers, because in brotherhood there is strength. Our weapons are strength, empathy, and honesty. We are mental health warriors, and this is our voice.
Sophie, welcome to the Mental Health Warriors podcast.
Oh, very glad to be here, Jason.
You know, I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation because I was telling people, I never expected, if you had talked to me even a few months ago, I never expected to be sitting in somebody's garden, drinking green tea, talking about breathing, and having this amazing conversation. So this is like another version of your backyard garden. It's just we're doing it virtually. You might even be sitting in there right now, actually.
Oh, I'm pretty close to it, that's for sure.
Okay, so yeah, there's so much I want to talk to you about. I mean, I guess the first thing that was really interesting is kind of your backstory. I mean, I like to talk about people's backstory so we have some context and people get to know you and feel connected with you. But you have a really interesting one about a very specific experience that you had that ended up with you being hospitalized and really changed the course of your life. So can you tell the audience about that?
Sure, be happy to. In my early 20s, I was under a lot of stress in my life, and I had a young daughter and looking after my mother dying. And so a lot of different experiences and circumstances kind of built into me having what they would call in psychiatric circles a psychotic break. Now, from my perspective and from my learning, and at the time, I would have called it, and it is called in other circles, a spiritual emergence. So I had a somewhat an enlightenment experience during meditation and had a very hard time coming back and being able to function. So I was admitted to a psychiatric hospital for 6 months, and I was diagnosed as a schizophrenic. And that was a very traumatic experience for me all around. And it changed the course of my life because after I got out of the psychiatric hospital, I went back to school. It took me a little while to get back on my feet, probably a couple of years, but I did end up going back to school, back to university and finishing my art degree and then going into Master's of Education in Counseling. And then after that, I worked with Psychiatric Survivors and in the mental health profession for over 20 years. So it was a very huge learning curve to come out the other side, get off the medication, really start to understand what happened to me and what's happening to other people. And then to have a lot of criticisms about how things are handled in the psychiatric profession, but not have any real, anything really substantial that I could offer as an alternative until many years later, when I started learning more about Ayurveda, which is a system of medicine from India, and my further studies in yoga and meditation. So I've had a very broad range of experiences that have led me to my understanding of things today.
Wow, that's so interesting. There's so much I want to talk about there. So this experience that led you to be hospitalized, I mean, so you have a very different perspective on it than what the medical system labeled you as, I guess. But can you talk about what that was like? I mean, one thing I'm always really interested in is when people have these experiences, you know, and with the benefit of time and space, sort of the relationship they have with them. Like I look at myself and I remember some of the feelings that I had when I was, you know, hurting and grieving and when my life was painful and my wife was sick. And the relationship I have at that time is almost abstract in a way because I know what I went through. I've put words to it, but I don't remember how visceral it was. It's hard for me to remember that. So can you just walk the listeners through sort of more in depth what that experience was like for you?
Sure. Well, along with certainly missing my daughter tremendously because we hadn't been separated since she was born, and she was not quite two when I was admitted to hospital. So that in itself was incredibly difficult for me. But prior to being admitted to hospital, I was doing a fairly intensive meditation practice during a time of great stress. And I know now that that certainly is contraindicated. So when your life is very, my mother was in diapers and gangrene in her feet and being taken by ambulance to hospital for even yet another round of chemo, which was insane at that point. But so all of those pieces, and looking after my daughter, just having been split up from my ex, and this intense meditation practice with a diet that was very low fat. So I was doing a macrobiotic diet at that time, which is very healthy. It's plant-based, grains, beans, vegetables, sea vegetables, a very healthy food, but fairly low fat. And so you take a low-fat diet with a person with my constitution and my tendencies to being a very sensitive individual. You put a lot of stress in their life, and then you throw a intense meditation practice on top of that. It's pretty much a recipe for having an enlightenment experience or a spiritual experience. A lot of times yogis in India and in other spiritual traditions, shamanism as well, you will go through a period of cleansing and also sometimes fasting, and put yourself through some hardships in order to get to that place where you experience yourself as not so much a physical being on this planet, although that's also the vehicle that we're in while we're here, but other layers of consciousness where basically I became so expanded in my consciousness and I could feel everything around me. So when you hear people talk about being one with everything, there were no boundaries between my experience of self and my experience of the rest of the world. So that meant that being in any place that was chaotic or being under fluorescent lighting, anything like that, I was so sensitive at that period of time that those things were actually somewhat painful to me. So I walked around for 3 weeks in that state, and it was a beautiful experience, absolutely beautiful experience. But I wasn't able to function in my day-to-day life, and there are not any options here in the West for people who are going through that experience, unfortunately. In other parts of the world, some things are done differently, and India is one of those places where they have a long tradition of understanding consciousness in a much deeper way than we do here in the West. And so certainly there are treatments that are available for people that either get into a state of spiritual emergence or also in states of psychosis or any kind of so-called mental illness. Lots of ways to help and assist someone come back to a normal, what is normal for them, way of being in the world that we have no clue about here.
Interesting. So one thing you said that's I think will be surprising to people is that you said meditation, or maybe it was deep meditation, but maybe you can talk about it more, was contraindicated in your situation. And I think people listening might find that surprising because you were mentioning you were under extreme stress. And I think that maybe the conventional wisdom is that meditation would be a perfect way of coping or getting yourself through that.
Oh, very good point. You have to look at the constitution and the condition of each individual. So for most people in the West, meditation is not going to be it's going to be a helpful practice during stress, because most people in the West are very firmly planted in their physical body, and in fact they think that's where they end, right? And the thinking in the West is that consciousness comes out of the material mind, where it's exactly opposite in the East. The body is in the mind, so consciousness is much greater than this physical vehicle that we're in. And people who have near-death experiences and things like that, they also talk about these things quite clearly, and so we're getting accounts of that in the West as well. But when you look at someone like myself who has a very, very sensitive constitution and has, I used to describe myself as a satellite dish, just kind of picking up on everything that was around me. But I wasn't very well grounded in my own body. So probably due to childhood trauma and things like that. So sometimes you see this with people who have a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder where there's unremembered trauma in their past. So they've suppressed it and they don't know it's there. Those folks are the ones you have to watch out for when they start a meditation practice, because sometimes that practice is going to open them up or will cause them to feel feelings of fear, sometimes because they don't have that well-defined egoic sense of self due to the trauma. So for most people in the West, meditation is going to be a great place to start, and especially if you bring the breath into it. And so when we start to talk about breathing, the other piece that wasn't there for me was my breath was not grounded in my body. And most people in the West, this is the case. So whenever I strongly recommend that breathing be properly, diaphragmatic breathing be in place before people start a meditation practice. And that is the basis of a meditation, is to start to feel very subtle sensations in the body using the breath.
You know, since we talked, I probably caught myself about 50,000 times breathing like crap. And so I still suck at it, but just our conversation gave me an increased level of awareness about some ideas about what I should be doing. But so you're walking around and you're in this state, and obviously that leads to you, as you said, being hospitalized for 6 months, which is really an incredibly long time. But how are you, quote, treated during this time? Were you just pumped full of medication, or were you therapy of some sort? Like, how did that unfold?
Yeah, geez. Well, first I was thrown into seclusion for 10 days. So they stripped me naked and locked me in a room with one of those bubble windows where they can see into the corners. And it was the middle of winter, and it was cold in there, and there's nothing in the room. You're just in there naked, sitting on the cold floor. And shot me would come in and shoot me up with drugs. Well, I am, like I said, a very sensitive system, and Western medication generally doesn't work all that well for me. So I did not. The drugs did bring me back to my body big time. But they also really cut off that piece of myself that was the creative, artistic, musical part of me that I was a big part of me. So my life as I knew it was over as far as they were concerned. You know, I was told I would have to take these drugs for the rest of my life. And like a diabetic, they always use that analogy, although we know there's lots that can be done for people with diabetes so that they don't need insulin. But so that was why I was in there so long. Was I did not respond well to the drugs. Then I was sexually assaulted by, that's a very tidy word for rape, but rape by a male nurse on the ward. And so further traumatization, and the therapy I received was industrial therapy, where I sorted bubble gum from wrappers for old Peachy at the time.
What?
Yep. You got paid like pennies per hour that you were there and doing your little job. And so, having gone from being a university student with an interest in art and music and my daughter and to this is my life, I pretty much was in a very, very desperate state. And I did have an understanding of what had gone on for me in terms of my spiritual experience, because I had been doing reading in that area. So that was at least something that I could kind of hang on to, that I could make some kind of sense out of what had happened to me. But it really did take a couple of years to put my life back together after that. And I was very fortunate when I came out of the psychiatric hospital that a good friend of mine said, "You're in bad shape. You need to see a counselor in London." And I did. I went to see her and did see her for several years after that. She was a wonderful support, but she had seen this many times where someone was over-medicated due to a traumatic, stressful event in their life that was never even much acknowledged by the medical staff, right?
Yeah. So when you came out of the hospital, did you believe that you were schizophrenic?
No. I didn't believe I was schizophrenic, but I also didn't know what to do. Mm-hmm. So I was in a pretty bad state, and I said to myself, I'll give it a year for my daughter's sake. If I hadn't had her, I probably would have killed myself in the psychiatric institution. But I thought, well, I'll give it one more year. If things don't get better, that's my option. So I definitely understand people, especially intelligent, creative people who get into that system and their lives are so devastated by the treatment. Forget whatever got them there in the first place. That's never dealt with or looked at. But the treatment itself can be kind of the nail in the coffin for a lot of people. Can you hear my cat?
I can hear your cat.
Would you like me to get him out of the room?
Sure. Yeah, whatever.
Okay, buddy, come on. Oh, well,
I love keeping it real.
Yeah, he's a little heavy. So, I'm just trying to boot him out the door here. Out you go. All right, there we are.
That's funny. So then, as you go through this counseling, I mean, at this point, what is that doing for you? What realizations are you having?
Well, first of all, we had to get me off the drugs. So, I mean, it was a great relief for me the first time I saw her. And by the end of the session, she said, "You're not schizophrenic, you're strung out on drugs." And so that for me just gave me hope. And she had a referral to a psychiatrist in the community who had helped her with other people before to get them off the medication. And it was a process. Getting off the medication took a good almost a year in itself. And this is what a lot of people don't understand and why they get into trouble. You can't just start taking those drugs, especially at the high doses that they often will give them, and come off them cold turkey. That's pretty much a recipe for another the side effects of coming cold turkey off those medications is often a psychotic break. So, especially if you're on neuroleptics, and even the antidepressants, you want to be careful. You want to go slowly, and you have to deal with the issues in your life that have gotten you there in the first place. And you have to address diet and lifestyle, your relationships, and you're having a supportive community around you, and also having some kind of understanding for your own self of what you're here for and why you're here. So it took a while to get off the meds, and each time that I would reduce the medication, I would be very ill for several days. It would be like a really bad flu that just didn't feel good at all. So through a process of coming off the medication and getting some help to address the issues that got me there in the first place. And one thing I don't know if I mentioned was that I'm adopted. And if you look at there's been studies where they've looked at the population of psychiatric institutions, and some studies will find that up to 40% of the people in there are adopted. And yeah, kind of interesting. So, and at that time when I had that experience that ended me up in the hospital, I had recently met my biological parents, and there were some stressors around that relationship as well. So I had a lot of kind of old childhood stuff coming up at the same time that my adopted mom was dying, and my adopted father had died years before. So, when you look at people's lives, and I worked in mental health for 25 years, community mental health, so I certainly met with a lot of people who were in similar situations to myself. But what I found, and people who work in the field will tell you this, is that people who end up in psychiatric institutions often have childhood trauma that has never been dealt with. So a big part of my healing from the whole experience was addressing some of those issues. Luckily, the counselor that I went to had a lot of experience with adoption and with teasing out those relationships. And she was just instrumental. I mean, to this day, I am entirely grateful to her for what she has done for me. And I know there's many other people in the community who feel the same way about her. And I would say her name, but I don't know if I...
Well, you can ask her, and if she wants a shout out, we'll put it in the show notes page. How's that? So
yeah, okay.
That's so. One thing I'm curious about, and we'll get to the everything related to breath and all that. But I'm curious about when you say that you had to deal with some of those things. I think the unresolved trauma. What did that look like for you? Like, what was that process like? Because I think a lot of people it's amazing how many people have experienced some sort of trauma in their childhood that they haven't dealt with. And I think one of the things that scares the hell out of them is they don't even have a concept of what, quote, dealing with it might look like. And they're terrified of confronting it and all of those kind of things. So what did that look like for you?
Well, it's been a process over my life, and I've learned many things over the years, but it looked like a lot of talking and also acknowledging the feelings that couldn't be heard at the time when things were happening as a child, and starting to reparent myself because I didn't get proper parenting as a child, or parenting that would allow me to be able to acknowledge my feelings and know how to express them. So a lot of expressing feelings, but not getting to a place where you were so wallowing in it that you couldn't function, right? So in the beginning of this, probably in the 70s and 80s, when I was starting to work in counseling in the late 80s, the feminist movement, there was lots going on with working with women and childhood sexual abuse and other traumas, and now that is fairly open and talked about compared to what it was back in the 60s. You just didn't talk about that. So what we found, though, in doing the counseling, we would do these group counseling sessions, and people would start talking about things that had happened to them, and then other people are getting triggered, and they're leaving the session in an emotional mess, basically. And we were finding people's lives were starting to fall apart, and they weren't able to function because they were delving into this muck, stuff that had happened to them, and they're in it, but there's no resolution, right? So I think it's very important that if you do have that kind of a background, and some people don't even know that they have it, but that you find someone who is an expert at dealing with that, and you're looking at a little bit of time to work through it. So you do need to find a counselor that you resonate with, that's really listening to you, that's has knowledge of how to keep you safe while going through this process. Because the last thing I needed at that time would be to have my life fall apart again, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So we did a lot of practical things. She would give me things to do each week, and there were support groups also at the center that I was at. So I joined a couple of those support groups, and that added a little extra structure in my week and helped me to get through until I saw her next. So she was very good at making sure that there were a lot of safeguards put in place while we did this work, and as I was coming off the medication, so it was a bit of a mess for a while, but I had expert help. I was very, very fortunate to have found her. And I know that not everyone is as fortunate. And certainly working in the mental health field, the biggest hardship of any of that, working in that field, and I worked in some great places. I worked in a psychiatric survivor drop-in center in London here, Can Voice, and I worked in another center, Search in Strathroy. It's no longer Search anymore, but we had some great programs. I taught yoga there, lots of community support. But we really tried to keep our clients out of the psychiatric hospital, because we knew that, and really the only reason we would ever take them there is if we were concerned about their safety. And we knew that they really weren't going to get a whole lot of help there. It was more housing.
Right. So what's your definition of a psychiatric survivor? Because I remember you using that term when we talked the first time.
For me, it's anyone who's been through the system and is still alive to talk about it.
Okay.
I think anyone who's been there, and I have to say one caveat: there is some good work being done around trauma at some of the hospitals regarding using dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, and that's something that I also taught, and that we did at that place that I worked at Search with our trauma survivors. So that's a piece where they're actually doing some good work. But I know that the lineup to get into that program is great. So it's not meeting the needs of the amount of people that need the service. So that would be where I would be putting some mental health dollars for sure.
Yeah, I'm actually taking with Sabrina Andrews a family connections facilitator course. So it's a peer support for people with borderline, for family members of people with borderline personality disorder, and I think DBT is a component of that, or at least learning about it to some extent. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Oh yes, and Sabrina's and I have been co-workers in the past at Search, and yes, I think extremely highly of her work. So you're in good hands there.
So tell me about then this journey that you have gone on after you have this experience, and then you go through the psychiatric system, you're getting counseling, you're working through your childhood trauma, and how does this I don't know even what to call it, a spiritual awakening, opening your heart to a different path. Like, how does that unfold for you?
Well, I was in the middle of my Bachelor of Fine Arts degree when this whole experience happened. So I did go back and finish that degree, and my final show, my graduating art show, was all about my experience in the psychiatric institution. So that was very therapeutic and kind of working through some stuff. It was very therapeutic for me, but it was also very educational for people who came to the show. And I think I mentioned to you that at the time my show was on the LPH, which is no longer open, London Psychiatric Hospital, was under investigation, and two of the investigators in their trench coats came to the show. So that was a bit of a highlight for me, actually.
Wow, that's different.
Yeah, it was. It was really kind of a little bit out there, Mission Impossible or something. I don't know, but a little odd. So I finished my art degree, and then I did the art therapy diploma at Western. So it made me want to go into the direction of more social work. And then I was accepted into the Masters of Education Counseling program, which is a very small program that takes 12 students a year. It's difficult to get in. So I was very fortunate to get into that program, and it was a wonderful couple of years with wonderful teachers there, very, very Rogerian talk therapy. We did some cognitive behavioral work as well, but it was a very empathetic type of learning about counseling, how to be a very good listener with a very skilled ability to ask questions and get to the root of things. So, and then after that, I went right into working with Psychiatric Survivors. I was in university at the time, and there was a call out for volunteers to be on a board for mental health changes in the mental health system. And I applied to be on that board and got chosen. And it was interesting that I got chosen because there was a psychiatric survivors group in town that were very politically active and socially active, and they had put forth a couple of very good people to be on that board. But who did they choose? They chose a university student that had no connections to any of these groups. And I thought, isn't that politically interesting that they chose me and not one of these people who was very well informed? So at that meeting, the people from Can Voice were there, and the CEO at the time or ED at the time came up and said to me, do you want a job? So I wasn't even finished my master's. I was just finishing it up. I had a couple more months to go, and I started working at this psychiatric survivor drop-in center. And that was a great education. I had a lot of support. There were lots of people coming there who had very similar perspective on things that had happened to them. And we definitely all had a bond because of our experiences in the psychiatric system. And so I worked there for many years, and I worked at the Sexual Assault Center here in London. I did some volunteer work at back then it was called the Battered Women's Advocacy Center. It's now the London Abused Women's Center. And I worked with homeless people, was part of a group of people in London who started up Streetscape at the time, it was called, and that was an outreach for people who were living on the street, and I worked as an outreach worker there as well. So I had a lot of varied experiences, and then worked out in community mental health out in West Middlesex County. So that was kind of the progression of how I got from, being diagnosed as schizophrenic to changing my life and using that experience to help other people.
And so that is so interesting. I mean, yeah, man, you never know how life is going to unfold. But so that, what was the catalyst, or I guess a decision point for your journey into Ayurveda?
That's also ties into this story. I started meditating and doing hatha yoga when I was 10 years old. So, my mother taught me how to meditate very inadvertently, because as she would go into her screaming rages, I would, in order to kind of survive it, I was such a sensitive little thing, I would stare at the African violets or the fish tank, something that was alive. And I would just kind of focus until I felt kind of expanded and not really there. So that was how I dealt with that as a child. And then as I, started reading about yoga and the few little books that were on the market in the West at the time, Richard Hittleman's Guide to Yoga, that's the one that those of us who started way back when will remember. So I found there to start to use breathing and with stretching. I was always doing gymnastics as a kid, but when I started deliberately breathing with movement, that was just a beautiful experience for me, and really helped me through a lot of things, even through the psychiatric hospital. I was allowed to do yoga in bed. So that did help me. But I really didn't know how to breathe. And I took, probably about 15 years ago now, I took a yoga teacher training course in London. It was the first one offered here in London. And it was a year long. And so I became a yoga teacher after that. And I taught yoga at that mental health center, as I mentioned. And then have always been interested in diet and health. I saw my mother get sick and sicker, taking more and more drugs as, she developed this illness and that illness and diabetes and cancer. So I saw how the current, I wouldn't even call it a health care system. I think we have a disease management system. And I saw how that failed her, and I saw what she ate every day too, and how that contributed to her illness. So I got hooked up with a naturopath Ayurvedic doctor in town at the time, and he was an expert on breathing and yoga, very well read in that field, and we eventually ended up being partners for 10 years. So we ran a Ayurvedic and clinic, Thai massage clinic. So what happened? I met him. I learned how to breathe. I learned how to use my breath during meditation to keep me grounded in my body. And I started using those skills and that awareness with my clients as well. And then one day I was rubbing his feet and he said, "Oh, that's a nice massage. You should be a massage therapist. You should be a Thai massage therapist." I didn't even know what Thai massage was at the time. So I went to Toronto and I had a treatment, and I totally loved it. And I understood a whole lot about it because of my work with breathing and my sensitivity in the body at the time. And the basis of Thai massage, the philosophical and theoretical basis, is in Ayurveda, Chinese medicine, and Buddhist meditation practice. So those three things were right up my alley. And So after meeting my partner, who was an Ayurvedic doctor under the umbrella of naturopathy, I started studying Ayurveda, and I would do all the cooking classes for the clients. So you can understand Ayurveda intellectually, but if you don't know how to cook, you can't implement it into your life. So he would see clients. I would see people get better. I saw people get better from irritable bowel syndrome simply by changing their breathing. So yeah, it's immense what kind of changes can happen when you shift from a fight and flight breathing, which most people in the West are in. I've been a Thai massage therapist now for 13 years, and in that time, I think I've met, and I'll be generous here, but I can really think of 3 people, but I'll say 5 people who were actually breathing with a proper diaphragmatic breath.
Hey, hold on a second. So add 1 to that after we met, right?
Oh yeah. Right. Oh yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm just kidding.
It's true. Like it's and myself, I understand it because it was the same for me, right? So I know what my process was in going through that shifting, and it becomes having to be aware that you are breathing, and then you have to become aware of where you are breathing. And then that becomes this amazing journey of becoming intimately connected with the you who's inside you. So wherever your breath goes, your consciousness will follow. And wherever your consciousness goes, your breath will follow. So if you're up in your head all day thinking, and most people I meet are heads that are pulling bodies around. They're not in their body. I meet people who don't know that their feet are cold. Or if they do, they don't do anything about it. They just ignore being comfortable in their bodies. And when the breath is high up in the chest, like most people's is, then you're in a chronic fight or flight, adrenal overload, stressed out state. And so you can talk about doing things for, learning to relax and working with positive affirmations, and all those things are good. But if the breath isn't addressed, then everything else is going to be affected. Your digestion's affected. The quality of your thoughts will be affected. Because if you're in fight or flight, every breath you take, 26,000 times a day, is telling your body there's something wrong. And so your mind can never fully relax. Your mind cannot get to a place of peace and calm and quiet if the breath is in this physiological state of stress. So no matter what comes at you in life, and there's always going to be stressful things, it's how we handle it. And sometimes we need lots of support and help for the big things in life, but anytime something comes at me now, the first thing I do is make sure my breath, I'm breathing properly, my breath is down, and that's my first defense against anything negative or upsetting that's coming my way. And I, a couple years ago, I probably getting close to 3 now, I broke up with that naturopathic doctor that I was partners with for 10 years. And that was a very difficult time for me because I had always had his support being self-employed, and now I was going out on my own, and I was losing a very significant relationship that was very stimulating on many levels. He was definitely a mentor for me for many years. And so that was a really good practice time for keeping the breath down. So during those times where things come at us and that are stressful, that's why we want to practice and meditate and really become aware of our bodies, right down to the soles of our feet and the palms of our hands, so that we can stay in our bodies, stay embodied, and be grounded when these difficult experiences come our way.
So I think one thing that I can imagine some people listening might be thinking is, we've been told our entire life, whether it's in school or, taking some type of anatomy class or biology class, that breathing is an involuntary process. And I can imagine some people thinking, like, okay, come on, we're born knowing how to breathe. Like, nobody teaches us. It's just part of being a human being. What happens to get us from this point of, I'm sure when we're born, breathing properly, to getting to the point where we're now breathing in a way that's in our upper chest and causing this fight or flight response?
Yeah, most babies do breathe properly. So if you look at a baby or animals that haven't been traumatized, you're going to see that their abdomen expands on the in-breath, and that movement of that, so when the abdomen expands, the diaphragm is descending and flattening like it should. And when that movement happens with a baby, because there's not a whole lot of tension in the body in the way, you will see that movement go right out the arms and right down. More, you probably see it in the arms, but if you're sensitive, and when I'm working on people, I can feel it in the body. I know if they've got their anal sphincter clenched because I can't feel the breath coming, that movement in through the legs and through the feet. So it's a very different experience of being embodied when your breath is fully descending. So what generally happens is around 10 years old, probably earlier for children who are in traumatic circumstances. But around 10 years old, you start shifting the breath up into the chest as the adults are doing around you. And I think there's a aspect of being rushed or hurried, and also stress, maybe in school or socially, around that age as well, starting to come into the preteen years, perhaps. So we start to see that happening at that age. Now, when I was traveling India, which I did extensively back in 2008 and 9, when you would go into the villages where people were still kind of living like they have had, they've done for many hundreds of years, beautiful posture, straight spines, and the children would smile with their eyes. When there was just a peaceful, happy way of life. They weren't being rushed. They weren't carted off to this thing, then that thing, then hurry up, get your coat, we're going to be late, all that kind of stuff. That just wasn't happening in their lives. But then you go into the major cities, and you start to see the postures that we have here. The heads are forward, the shoulders are slouched. There's a leaning forward to the walk. And so all of that is fight or flight. Anyone with that kind of posture, that the shoulders start to pull in when the breath is pulled up in the chest. So, and by that, maybe I can give a few specifics about what I mean by that. So I think when we met, I asked you to just notice. And for people who are listening, you can just notice, where's your tongue right now? So is it pressed against your teeth or the roof of your mouth? And if that's the case, then you know that your diaphragm is being sucked up towards your heart and lungs with each in-breath, because that's one of the signs. So there will be this whole upward pressure of the diaphragm being pulled up that will lodge in the, and if we want to use yogic language, throat chakra. So that kind of breathing causes all kinds of eyes, nose, ears, throat, heart, high blood pressure, those kinds of issues, sinus problems. All of those things will be exacerbated or perhaps even caused by a breath that is pulling the diaphragm up. Now, when the diaphragm descends, then there's room made in the lungs and room made for the heart, rather than it being squished by the diaphragm. So the tongue should be flat and relaxed on the bottom palate. And it's like there's a tube from your mouth all the way through your body, like to your stomach, your intestinal tract, going out through your anal sphincter. And on the inhale, that whole tube should expand and relax. And then on the exhale, there's kind of a coming back in towards the body and a relaxation. And then again on the inhale, there's an expansion, and then a relaxing and a kind of deflating on the exhale. And for that to happen, the abdomen has to move. It can't be held tight. And women in particular are very insistent almost in holding the abdomen tight. And we had, a generation of corsets, and some people even still will squeeze themselves into things to make the belly not stick out as much. So we have to start to embrace our physicality and be embodied in our body with the breath.
I never realized until this moment just how destructive these ridiculous skinny jeans I'm wearing right now are. Maybe I'll put my microphone on mute and take my pants off and start breathing right.
Well, there's a saying, change your clothes and change your life. So when you go to India, people aren't wearing these tight belts and ties, and men have the ties around the throats and the belts around the waist. Women wear bras that are much too tight to breathe properly. So when they get fitted, no one's breathing properly. So, the bra around the rib cage has to be able to expand and not be so tight that it's digging in, because the rib cage is supposed to move side to side and back to front. Most people, it's held rigid and sucked up. And so if your shoulders are lifting towards your ears when you breathe, you're sucking up the diaphragm. And if your breath is totally relaxed, you can feel a movement of that breath at the perineum, and that's the place between the anus and the genitals. So that should move outward with each inhale. And it's not about thinking about it. It's about actually feeling it in your body. And I think we talked a bit when we met about how that can influence your sex life. And so if you have two people who are breathing right down to the pelvic floor, that's a very different experience when you have sex than if you're up in your chest breathing. And so then you have two people breathing that way, then you're starting to get into tantric sex. And so for women and men who have difficulty orgasming, that definitely is going to be a key piece that can help alleviate that issue. But without the breath being in the body, we're not grounded on the planet. You can imagine yourself being a tree with roots and all that stuff, and that's really lovely, and I've had lovely experiences doing that. But that's still up in the head. It's not in the body. You can still do those lovely visualizations and have your breath, your diaphragm, squishing your heart and lungs on every breath. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, you just cut it a little bit there, but
okay, I wasn't sure. And most yoga teachers, I have to say, are confused about breathing, because most yoga teachers who are teaching in the training programs are also breathing up in the chest. So we see people teaching this 3-part breath where they're pushing the belly out, flaring the rib cage, and then sucking up into the chest. And that is an incorrect way to teach the 3-part breath.
So at this point, you've been doing this type of breathing for so long, and I guess, is it, I don't want to say is it unconscious, because I feel like that would defeat the purpose of conscious breathing, I guess, but how much do you still think about this type of breathing?
I don't think about it. I feel it with every breath.
Okay.
So I'm in my body. I'm always, even when we're sitting here talking, before I start to speak, I feel my perineum move outward. So it's and believe me, that's a process, because it probably took me 3 months to get my tongue off the roof of my mouth. So I had a breath that was very high in my chest. And the yoga teacher training did not help that at all. They do lots of exercises, and actually some of those exercises can be quite detrimental if they're not done with this type of awareness of breath. So you have to have an unconstricted breath before you start adding some of these holdings that are done with the locks that are practiced in yogic breathing. So in the West, we've really jumped the gun and gone to a very simplistic and uneducated type of yoga without the real depth of knowledge that's necessary and experience in order to really give it its due. But a lot of wonderful yoga teachers out there. I would not, if you have a class you love, keep going, because I tell you, the people that I see for Thai massage who are doing really well into their 70s and 80s are people who keep moving their bodies in different directions. They're either dancing or doing yoga or Tai Chi, some of those things that really get you to not just move in these repetitive types of ways that we tend to do in the West here.
When someone comes to you and says, I'm feeling a tremendous amount of anxiety, I feel overwhelmed, or whatever the typical symptoms of a traditional Western lifestyle, I guess, what do you tell them?
Well, first of all, we address the breath, and that's the first thing that's addressed for anxiety in many places in Europe too. I mean, that should be the first treatment for anxiety, worry, because if I breathe up in my chest now, I immediately will feel more anxious than I did the breath before, because you are squishing your heart and lungs and telling your whole nervous system that there's something wrong. So number one, that's it. But you also have to look at your lifestyle. Are you overworked? Have you got one of these crazy lifestyles where you're just run all the time and you feel you live your life by a clock and there's never enough time? So you have to look at that, and then you have to look at the diet. Is it full of processed junk food? Is it got, are you being nourished? If you're eating out a lot and eating fast food or anything that comes in a box that's been made by a human, it doesn't get into my house. So, we can't expect to be happy, healthy, wise if we're not inputting quality things into our bodies and our lives. And so having a look at that for ourselves and getting some support around shifting that. Simple things. One of Ayurveda has just some beautiful lifestyle tips and tricks that can really shift things for people. And the word itself, Ayur, A-Y-U-R, Ayur means life. And Veda, V-E-D-A, means knowledge. So it's the knowledge of life. And this is a vast system of medicine. They were doing brain surgery 5,000 years ago. And I will study until I pass off this planet, and I still won't know all there is to know. It's a brilliant system of medicine that's coming more and more our way. The other system of medicine that's really worthwhile if someone is ill to look into is Chinese medicine, traditional Chinese medicine. I don't find it as accessible as Ayurveda. When I teach people start the basic system and philosophy of Ayurveda, people say things like, oh, this just makes so much sense, and why aren't we taught this in school? And I would love for the schools to be teaching this. It would change our world. So, when we start to learn, gain some real knowledge and wisdom, and Ayurveda has that to give us in spades, and it's just sitting there waiting for us, then that can really start to shift and change your entire life.
I think it's probably not a coincidence that as we pursue this lifestyle, this consumption-based lifestyle, and we do things as we want more stuff. We want a bigger house. We want a bigger car. We have this suburban lifestyle where we drive everywhere, and we do things that are not in alignment with the best interests of the planet and, or this system that we're all a part of. I guess it's when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense that being out of alignment with, say, Mother Earth causes us to be out of alignment with ourselves.
Oh, exactly, Jason. It's we are living in a time of insanity, right down to shitting into our water supply. If I can be blunt, like that's one of the craziest things we've ever done. So
I never really thought about it that way.
It's crazy. It really is. It should be going back into the earth as compost. So, I'm working towards a tiny home with a compostable toilet and being off grid. And, that's my next little bit on my path. But, I think for many of us, it's simply starting to look at consumption and when you have a lot of stuff around you and a lot of clutter around you, that's indicative too of our mental state. So the more that things are messy on the outside, often the more there's kind of confusion and lack of clarity on the inside. And so, we all know those geniuses with messy desks too. So there's always exceptions. But certainly starting to feel some peace, you have to have some peace in your life. I think all of us want a sense of freedom and a sense of peace, and a lot of us feel trapped into situations that are detrimental to our health and not necessarily that helpful for the people we love around us either. You may be thinking that you're doing all these things for your kids.
Sorry, you cut out. So I'm going to keep talking. I'm going to start talking here. And
okay, sorry.
But I was just going to say, like when I was at your place, it was beautifully peaceful, and I think that just being able, I consider our home peaceful as well, but yours was at another level. I mean, it was simple and calm, and I don't know, it felt like I didn't want to leave. So, and I think that's wonderful that you're modeling, the philosophy that you believe in. I think that's a wonderful thing. So I think that's a wrap. I feel like, is there anything else anything we didn't cover that you feel passionately about that you want to let our audience know about?
Oh, lots. So
well, I'm sure there is. We'll have to do this again sometime for sure.
Yeah. I'm very passionate about Ayurveda, and I think if there's anything that can be helpful for people, give yourself a treat. Come in for a Thai massage. We'll work on breath. And I always do that with people in the first session because it is so important. And there's lots about Ayurveda online. I have an online course that's about to launch, and you can certainly look me up as well. But that would be the direction that I would point people to, and I can certainly talk about any of these things a lot longer than we have today. So, but I appreciate the opportunity, and it's been wonderful to meet you, Jason. I think you're doing some very interesting, important work.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Thank you so much for being on the show. And we'll include all the links to how people can get in touch with you and find out more about what you're doing in the show notes page. And I would love to have you back at some point to dig into some more interesting topics, because I know you are an Ayurvedic encyclopedia.
Okay. Well, thanks, Jason. Great to be with you today.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you to Sophie for that awesome conversation. Again, I learned so much, and I'm implementing in my life right now. And it's amazing how many times I've come across the power of the breath. But you really helped drive home to me how important it really is. So thank you for that. And I'm going to end this episode like I end every single episode, and that's by saying, if you've struggled, I want you to know that I've struggled too. And if you ever want to talk to me, I mean, you got to know by now that I'm not going to judge you. But I also want to encourage you to give that gift to somebody else, okay? Because it's a gift that you can give today. We've all struggled. We've all made mistakes. We've all had regrets. We've all felt like shit. We've all felt guilty, full of shame, all those things. We've all been there, right? It's one of the things that binds us together as human beings. And by letting other people know that you've been there, that you've done those things, and that you've moved past them, it's... You know what? Honestly, not even maybe move past them, just that you've been there is a huge open door for somebody else to walk through and form a relationship with you and to feel safe. And I'll be honest with you, for a lot of people, it'll be the first time they've ever felt safe. So I really, really hope you consider giving somebody that gift today. All right, we'll see you next time.